Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another deep dive
Yeah.
into a uh, really sensitive topic today.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict,
Okay.
and we've got a lot of different perspectives to look at today.
Right.
We're going to be talking about the Palestinian view of history. We're going to be talking about thoughts within the Jewish diaspora,
Mm-hmm.
even some comparisons to what's happening in Ukraine.
Okay.
But uh, our mission here, I think it's important to say right up front,
Right.
we're not trying to pick sides here.
Right.
We're just trying to understand this conflict
I think that's so
from as
important.
many different angles as possible, even if you're totally new to this.
Yeah.
Um, so I think one of the things that really stuck out to me
Yeah.
in the material that we read
Mm.
is how Palestinians view
Yes.
this conflict
Yeah.
as like a colonial project.
Mhm.
What does that even mean?
Well, it's not just a phrase.
Wow.
It's a deeply held belief, and it kind of gets to the heart of how they view the creation of Israel,
Yeah.
which is that it came at the direct expense of the Palestinian people.
Okay.
So they see it as a process of displacement
Mm-hmm.
where their land was taken
Yeah.
and their communities were fragmented. And this goes all the way back to 1948.
So you're saying, like, to understand how Palestinians view this conflict today,
Mm-hmm.
we have to understand 1938,
Yes, absolutely.
what they call the Nakba.
Yes, the catastrophe.
Right.
Imagine being forced from your home, becoming a refugee,
Yeah.
and seeing the land that you considered yours
Mm-hmm.
become part of a different country.
Right.
That experience, that sense of loss and injustice,
Yeah.
it echoes through generations.
I bet.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about, like, what's happening in Gaza today,
Mm,
there's this word that kept coming up,
yeah,
fragmentation.
right.
What is that?
So fragmentation is basically about
Okay.
dividing a population to weaken their resistance.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, think about it like this. You take a piece of cloth and you keep tearing it into smaller
Okay.
and smaller pieces.
Right.
It becomes much easier to control.
Right?
And so in the context of Israel-Palestine, you see this fragmentation physically.
Give me an example.
Okay, well, the West Bank is a great example.
Okay.
It's divided by Israeli settlements and checkpoints.
Okay.
Gaza's blockaded.
Yeah.
And then there's an example that came up in our sources, Sheikh Jarrah,
Right. Shaded jar.
which is a neighborhood in East Jerusalem
Okay.
where Palestinian families have been fighting eviction from homes that they've lived in for generations.
Wow.
So,
That's got to be scary.
yeah, and it creates this immense psychological pressure, the
Yeah.
fear of losing your home,
Mm-hmm.
your connection to a particular place.
And then on top of all that,
Yeah,
it almost seems like
Yeah.
the language that's used
yeah,
just makes the situation worse.
it does.
Like we saw in the articles that we read,
Right.
people using the term human animals
Yes.
to describe Palestinians.
Unfortunately, that kind of dehumanizing rhetoric,
It's just unbelievable.
it is a common tactic. We see it in conflicts throughout history.
Yeah.
And it's much easier to justify violence and oppression when you don't view the other side as fully human.
Right. It's easier to,
Exactly.
commit atrocities
Right.
when you don't even view the other group as human.
Exactly. And it's something to be very aware of when you're reading or listening to anything about this conflict.
Yeah.
Who's using this kind of language?
Right.
And what are they hoping to achieve by doing so?
Yeah. Are they intentionally trying to incite violence by using this kind of language?
It makes you wonder.
It does. And so we're seeing how this conflict
Yeah.
is viewed by Palestinians
Right.
through this lens of colonialism,
Mm.
through this lens of historical injustice,
Yeah.
going back to 1948 and even before.
Right.
And so I guess my question is, how do other viewpoints even begin to address that?
Yeah, that's a question a lot of people are grappling with, particularly within the Jewish diaspora.
All right, so let's shift gears and talk about that.
Okay.
What are some of these different viewpoints that we're seeing emerge?
Mm-hmm.
And why are they coming to the forefront now?
Yeah. Well, I think for a long time, the dominant narrative within the Jewish diaspora
Yeah.
was one of unwavering support for Israel.
Right.
But what we're seeing now,
Yeah.
particularly among younger generations,
Okay.
is this growing sense of questioning
Okay.
and even disillusionment.
So this idea of malaise and questioning,
Yes.
what's driving that?
Well,
Is it just about disagreeing with specific policies, or is there something deeper?
I think it's multifaceted.
Okay.
Social media has given a platform to voices that were previously marginalized,
Right.
including Palestinians themselves.
Okay.
So younger Jews are being exposed to a wider range of perspectives
Yeah.
on the conflict than ever before.
Makes sense.
And they're asking tough questions
Okay.
about Israel's actions and whether they align with their own values.
One of the things that someone said that really stuck with me
Yeah.
was,
Mhm.
quote, "My grandparents' Israel isn't my Israel."
Wow.
And I thought that was really interesting
It is.
because it seems to suggest that there's this disconnect
Yeah, there is this disconnect between
between generations.
older generations who saw the creation of Israel
Right.
as this triumph over persecution,
Right.
and younger Jews who are more likely to question that narrative of
That's right.
Israel as a perpetual victim.
And they're also more aware of.
They see the Palestinian suffering,
Right.
and they're less willing to accept the argument that any criticism of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic.
Because that's the thing, right? It's like, how do you walk that line?
Yes, it's a very difficult line to walk.
Because you don't want to
Right.
diminish anti-Semitism.
Anti-Semitism is a very real and persistent threat.
Right.
And it's crucial to acknowledge that.
Right. But then at the same time, you don't want to use that
Right.
to shut down criticism of Israel.
You can't use that to silence legitimate criticism of Israeli government policies.
Right. So how do you navigate that?
It's tough, and I think a lot of young Jewish people are struggling with this.
Yeah.
Feeling caught between these two very powerful forces.
It's a really tough situation to be in.
It is a complex issue with no easy answers.
Yeah.
I think some people choose to disengage entirely.
Just say it's too much.
Yeah, they feel overwhelmed by the weight of this conflict and its history.
Right.
Others are finding ways to reconcile their Jewish identity with their support for Palestinian rights.
Okay. So they're trying to find that balance.
Yeah, they're engaging in activism.
Okay.
They're advocating for a more just and equitable future for both peoples.
It sounds like this is causing a lot of soul searching within the Jewish community.
It is.
Yeah.
And I think it's a conversation that's long overdue.
Yeah. It seems like there's been this kind of like, I don't know, hesitancy to go there.
Right.
But now we're seeing these shifting sands within the Jewish diaspora,
Yes.
grappling with identity and what it means to support justice and human rights in such a fraught context.
Absolutely.
But this conflict doesn't exist in a vacuum.
It doesn't.
And one of the things that I found really thought-provoking was the comparison that some are making
Yeah.
between what's happening in Israel-Palestine and the war in Ukraine.
Right.
It's not a connection I'd really made before, to be honest.
Yeah, it's a sensitive comparison
Okay.
and one that needs to be approached with a lot of nuance.
Okay.
But I can understand why people are drawing parallels,
Okay.
especially when you look at the language being used and the accusations that are being leveled.
Right. So when we talk about comparisons between Ukraine and Gaza,
Mm-hmm.
what are we even talking about?
Well, one of the things that really stood out to me
Yes.
was the use of the word genocide
Right.
on both sides.
Right.
Both in Ukraine and in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You see both sides accusing the other of trying to erase them.
And when you see that word genocide,
Yeah.
it makes you think about the Holocaust.
Right, and that's exactly what happened.
Right.
When Ukrainian President Zelensky
Yeah.
compared the Russian invasion to the Holocaust.
And that caused a lot of controversy in Israel.
It did.
Understandably so.
Yeah, because the Holocaust holds such a unique place in history.
Yeah.
And many people felt that that comparison,
Right.
while it was probably intended to rally support,
Mm-hmm.
actually diminished the suffering of Jews during World War II.
So how do you even talk about that?
Right, it's really tough.
Because on the one hand, you have people saying, look,
Yeah.
the horrors of war are horrible no matter what.
Yes.
The targeting of civilians, the use of dehumanizing language,
Right.
all of that is bad.
It's all bad.
But then on the other hand,
Yeah.
you have people saying you can't compare this to the Holocaust.
Right, and I think the key here is to acknowledge the suffering on all sides
Yeah.
without minimizing or equating different historical experiences.
Yeah, because even though there are some similarities
Right.
on the surface.
Right. We see the bombing of civilian areas.
Right.
We see the displacement of people.
We see accusations of war crimes.
Yes, but the historical and geopolitical contexts
Yeah.
are so different.
It's important to remember that.
It is.
That we can't just look at the surface.
Yeah, you have to understand the nuances
Right.
of each conflict.
So we've been talking about all these different perspectives,
Mhm.
Palestinian perspectives,
Okay.
Jewish perspectives,
Yeah.
comparisons to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's time we really focus on the actions of Israel,
Okay.
especially in Gaza,
Yeah.
because the sources that we read
Yes.
painted a pretty bleak picture.
They talked about grave humanitarian consequences.
Right, and even some really disturbing rhetoric
Yeah, like what?
from Israeli officials.
Okay.
So we're talking about reports of hospitals and schools being bombed,
Yeah.
the destruction of essential infrastructure,
Right.
the denial of basic necessities like food and water.
Right. To the civilian
And
population.
like, how is that even possible?
It's a really dire situation.
Yeah, and then you have these statements
Right.
from Israeli leaders that are just
Yeah.
adding fuel to the fire.
What kind of statements?
Like, one of the sources that we read
Yeah.
quoted an official referring to Palestinians as human animals.
Wow.
And then there was even mention of this historical event,
Yeah.
the annihilation of Amalek,
Right.
which some people interpret as a call for genocide.
Which is really scary.
It's really scary stuff. And it's like,
Yeah.
when you combine that with what's actually happening on the ground in Gaza,
Right?
it's really concerning.
It raises serious concerns about potential violations of international law.
Right.
Even crimes against humanity.
So how do we even get here?
Right.
What led to this?
Well, our sources pointed to the 1948 war.
Yeah, 1948 keeps coming up.
It does, doesn't it? The displacement of Palestinians that occurred then.
Yeah.
The subsequent occupation and then the ongoing blockade of Gaza.
Right.
All of these things are contributing to this crisis.
It's like this vicious cycle.
It is a cycle of pain and suffering that never seems to end.
So where do we go from here?
That's the million-dollar question.
It feels like there are no easy answers.
There really aren't.
So is there any hope?
I don't know if I have the answer to that,
Yeah.
but I do think that understanding the complexities
Okay.
is a really good place to start.
So understanding the history,
Right. The historical wounds,
Yeah.
the different narratives, the fears.
the traumas.
Yes, on both sides.
And maybe then we can start to imagine a different future.
Exactly one where dialogue replaces violence.
Yeah.
And where peace,
Peace and justice
yes,
is possible.
exact.
Well, thank you to everyone for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, this was a tough one.
It is a tough one, but it was an important one.
It was.
And we encourage you to keep learning. Keep asking those tough questions.
Yes.
And let's all work towards a future where everyone can live in peace.
Yes. I love that.
Thanks for being here with us today.